So, hi, I'm Mika Mignani. I am a philosophy postdoc with the Embedded Ethics program here at Harvard.
Hi, I'm Susan Kennedy, and I'm also a philosophy postdoc with the Embedded Ethics program at Harvard.
And before we get started, I'll just say a few things about the Embedded Ethics program. So we are an interdisciplinary team of philosophers and computer scientists working together to integrate ethics into the computer science curriculum. The idea behind this approach is to embed tools of ethical reasoning into computer science courses themselves. The reason for this is that when making decisions about the design, deployment, or development of a piece of technology, one is, whether or not one realizes it, making ethical decisions. That is, making decisions which stand to have social, political, or human impact. At Harvard, we think it's important for computer scientists to be equipped with tools for thinking through these implications.
Technology holds a lot of power and influence over us, and that means, by extension, that the people who design technology do too. Now that you're starting to think about what responsibilities you might have as computer scientists, so you can avoid notable mishaps, like face mash, for instance, we're going to turn your attention to the topic of social media platforms and how they affect the distribution of and engagement with news and information. It would seem that this topic is especially relevant now, given the recent US presidential election, where political content has been dominating the internet and television broadcasts, and controversy has played out on social media, garnering attention from around the world. Undoubtedly, technology has completely revolutionized the way information and news is both disseminated and consumed. Instead of paperboys shouting, "Get your news here," on the street corner, just about everyone uses the internet to stay up to date with what's happening, not just locally, but around the world. And in the past few years, social media platforms in particular have started to play a huge role in how people access, share, and engage with information. For instance, research shows that 44% of US adults report getting the news from Facebook. It's safe to say a lot has changed in recent years owing to developments in technology, and this matters when we consider what's at stake, namely the ability for the public to engage in discourse that supports a well-functioning democracy. So I'll first present to you a brief overview of where we came from and where we are now owing to technological developments, and then consider what challenges we're faced with today. Before the internet, news and information was almost entirely in the hands of a few major broadcast stations and print media outlets, otherwise known as the mass media sphere. Since a few organizations were responsible for disseminating all the news, information was essentially filtered through a narrow lens or narrow aperture from organizations to a wide public audience. The journalists who were responsible for researching and writing the content for these organizations all shared a professional ethos. They were concerned with truth, representation of social groups, creating a forum for criticism, clarifying public values, and offering comprehensive coverage. And notably, since the aim was to produce content that appealed to a wide audience, there was less polarization and extremist commentary than we see today. But the journalists responsible for news coverage were very uniform in a lot of ways. They were relatively affluent, highly educated, mostly white, male, and so forth. And this had effects on the coverage of racial politics, economic policy, and views about the role of the US in the world. Moreover, there were seldom opportunities for the audience to respond, to develop new themes or topics, or level criticism against the mass media sphere. There weren't any likes and comment sections for the newspaper or television broadcasts. If you didn't like it, well, tough luck. This all started to change in recent years as news coverage not only moved online, but onto social media platforms. We now live in a digitally networked public sphere. So instead of having a narrow aperture of communications, where just a few organizations disseminate information to the public, we now have a digital sphere with a wide aperture where lots of people can share news and information. More specifically, the sources of content are not just organizations and the professional journalists they employed, but the public, and particularly social media users. Anyone can tweet or post on Facebook, and anyone can read those tweets and posts. This not only resulted in greater diversity of content, but greater access to information as well. If you want to follow the news, there are a ton of options and free places online you can access with just a few mouse clicks. These prospects of increased diversity and access are what led many people to believe that the digital sphere held great promise for improving the public discourse that supports a well-functioning democracy. And in some ways, this has been true. For example, thanks to Twitter and Facebook, we saw the mobilization of social justice movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And the increased diversity of perspectives made it possible for individual researchers and scientists to weigh in on the CDC's claims about coronavirus. So while the CDC did not initially say coronavirus was characterized by airborne transmission leading to community spread, they ended up revising their stance after scientists took to Twitter with evidence proving that this was the case. While the digital sphere has brought about some improvements, it's also exacerbated some problems and created new challenges. For example, since anyone can create content, fact-checking and monitoring have become much more difficult. People are left to fend for themselves when it comes to figuring out whether something they read online is trustworthy. We've also seen increased personalization with respect to news and information, where specific content could be targeted to specific users by the means of curated news feeds on social media and cable news stations cropping up that take a particular angle on the news that they cover. This is significant because we end up with a somewhat paradoxical effect. Despite a greater diversity in the content that's available, there's less diversity in the news and information people actually end up consuming, with the personalization of information having a tendency to reinforce a person's viewpoints rather than challenge or broaden them. Additionally, in the absence of centralized sources of news, we've also seen different aims expressed by those creating and sharing content. Some have bypassed a concern for truth in an effort to garner more views and likes with extremist content or fake news. And fake news became a huge issue around the time of the 2016 presidential election, as there were concerns that the massive spread of misinformation on social media could influence or sway individuals' political views. While the spread of misinformation has always been an issue, it's surely been exacerbated by the digital public sphere, with social media platforms essentially pouring gasoline on the fire. The dissemination of fake news explodes on social media because the structure of digital environments, from likes to retweets, allows a single post on fake news to go viral, reaching the screens of millions around the world. And there are serious worries about how fake news has played a role in amplifying political polarization. So while technology has made possible unique advantages, it's also brought on unique challenges. One major question that we're faced with now is figuring out how content should be regulated on social media platforms, if at all. Given the scale of the problem, some might be skeptical, believing that any form of content regulation would be impossible. There's just too many people posting online to fact check them all, and fake news spreads so quickly, it's hard to stop before it's already reached a huge audience. And there's also worries that attempts to regulate content could end up becoming a form of censorship that violates the right to freedom of speech. But some people are more optimistic about the possibilities of designing social media platforms in a way that promotes and preserves democracy. In particular, there's a possibility that with responsibly designed algorithms and user interface choices, we might be able to slow the spread of fake news and more generally, improve the ways information is disseminated and engaged with on social media. For example, some people believe that companies like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube have a responsibility to regulate content because of the enormous influence they have over us. In particular, it's thought that social media platforms have a responsibility to police fake news and reduce the power of data-driven algorithms that personalize the user experience, even if doing these things would come at the cost of user engagement, resulting in less time spent on the platform and less advertising revenue. It's clear that the path going forward in terms of content regulation on social media platforms is going to be tricky. Whether or not we promote democratic ideals or undermine them will come down to the particular design choices we make. In order to use technology to create solutions to the problems we're facing today, we'll need to make informed decisions about design choices, and this requires some critical thinking about ethics and philosophy to figure out the best way to do this. But we're hoping that students like you taking CS50 can harness your creativity, technical knowledge, and ethical reasoning to design technology in a responsible way. So I'm now going to pass things over to Mika, who will tell you about some philosophical concepts that'll help you think proactively about particular design choices and algorithmic tools that can be implemented to structure social media platforms in a way that promotes democratic public discourse.
In Democracy and the Digital Public Sphere, an article which offers a fantastic diagnosis of our situation and from which Susan and I are drawing heavily upon for this lecture, the authors Joshua Cohen and Archon Fung tell us that the bloom is off the digital rose. As Susan was describing, we had such high hopes for the democratizing potential of social media and the internet. But now we face an environment in which fake news runs rampant, citizens appear to be dramatically polarized, information swirls in its own isolated bubbles, and hate speech reaches appalling levels of vitriol, all of which stand to threaten, or so people speculate, the conditions required for an effective democracy. So the following questions arise. In what ways are the conditions of democracy threatened? What can or should be done about it? Is the structure of our technology responsible, or is it just us as human beings creating these problems? In this module, we're focusing specifically on the issue of content regulation. Social media companies like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube are now all in the game of trying to address these problems through platform design and features. From one angle, then, they are acting in the service of protecting democracy by trying to get control over the spread of misinformation, the amplification of hate speech, and the deepening of polarization. However, from another angle, they're stepping in to shape the distribution of information, and depending on the particular design choices, might be said to be regulating or silencing speech, which, of course, is at odds with democratic commitments to free speech and discourse. The point of this module, then, is to give you some tools to think through these issues, tools for understanding the problem, diagnosing the sources of the problem, and brainstorming solutions. In the remaining 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to provide an overview of the main tools which you will find detailed in the readings. They are also the tools you will be asked to analyze in this week's lab. So first then, we need to think clearly about what is required for a healthy democracy. If we're going to be making claims about how tech threatens democracy, we better understand A, what a democracy is, and B, what sort of conditions support democracy such that those conditions could come under threat. In their article, Archon Fung, who is a professor in political science here at Harvard, and Joshua Cohen, who is a political philosopher now working with the faculty at Apple University, provide us with these tools. So behind the idea of democracy is an ideal of what political society should be. Fung and Cohen reduce this ideal to three elements. First, the idea of a democratic society, a society in which the political culture views individuals as free and equal, even though it is likely that these people have different interests, identities, and systems of belief. As citizens, they are committed to arriving at, through reflection and discourse, principles that will enable them to work together while respecting their freedom and equality. Second is the idea of a democratic political regime, which is characterized by regular elections, rights of participation, along with associative and expressive rights that make participation both informed and effective. Third, and lastly, is the idea of a deliberative democracy, according to which political discussion should appeal to reasons that are suitable for cooperation amongst free and equal persons. So in justifying a policy, you cannot appeal to, say, your own religion, given that others do not necessarily hold those same beliefs. You can appeal to the notion of, say, religious freedom, but not the particular beliefs contained within the religion itself. So democracy then is basically an ideal that we govern ourselves by collective decision-making that respects our freedom and equality. This decision-making consists not only of the formal procedures of voting, elections, and legislation, it is also informed by the informal public sphere. That is, citizens identifying problems and concerns, discussing and debating problems, expressing opinions, challenging viewpoints, and organizing around causes. This is an absolutely critical part of the democratic decision-making process. It is where we, as the public, form, test, disperse, exchange, challenge, and revise our views. The flow of information, along with user engagement on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, are all a part of this informal public sphere. In order that individuals can participate as free and equal citizens in this arena of public discourse, Cohen and Fung lay out a set of rights and opportunities that a well-functioning democracy will require. And these are the tools of analysis on offer. So first, rights. As citizens of a democracy, we have rights to basic liberties of expression and association. The right to expressive liberty is important not only for the freedom of the individual, so that he or she will not be censored, but also for democracy itself. It enables citizens to bring their ideas into conversation with one another and to criticize and hold accountable those who exercise power. Second is the opportunity for expression. Not only should we be free of censorship, but we should have fair opportunity to participate in public discussion. It shouldn't be the case that because someone is, say, wealthier or more powerful, that they have more opportunity to participate. Third is access. Each person should have good and equal access to quality and reliable information on public matters. That is, if we make the effort, we should be able to acquire this information. Effective participation in decision-making requires being informed. Fourth is diversity. Each person should have good and equal chances to hear a wide range of views. We need access to competing views in order to have a more informed and reasoned position. And lastly, number 5, communicative power. Citizens should have good and equal chances to explore interests and ideas in association with others, and through these associations to develop new concerns that might challenge the mainstream view. These rights and opportunities together provide critical conditions for enabling participation in public discussion. They might seem like a lot to keep track of initially, but if we're going to think through how social media threatens democracy, and more concretely, how platform design might promote or hinder democracy, these are valuable tools. We can use, say, the access condition, the idea that we should all have access to reliable information, as a lens of analysis. Does our platform prevent certain groups or users from accessing reliable information? Or we can use the diversity condition, the idea that we should all have access to a plurality of conflicting views, as a lens of analysis. So, for example, we might ask ourselves, does our platform create a filter bubble in which individuals are no longer confronted with opposing views? In addition to understanding what conditions support democratic society, we also need to understand the purported problems before we can propose effective interventions. Consider fake news. Why are people so gullible when it comes to fake news? Why do they often repost without proper critical assessment? Regina Rini, in the reading, proposes that in order to understand the phenomenon of fake news, we should think about it as a form of testimony. When another person shares information with you, you typically take it to be true. This is because of the norms governing our practice of testimony. When you assert something, passing it on to others, you typically take responsibility for its truth. It is assumed that you have either acquired evidence for it yourself, or if you've received this information from a source that you deem reliable. Most of our knowledge about the world comes through this practice. We could not possibly acquire evidence for all the beliefs we hold, so we often have to rely on sources we deem and hope to be credible. But social media, Rini points out, has unsettled testimonial norms. When someone posts a piece of news, we seem to hold two conflicting views. On the one hand, we see it as an act of endorsement. The person posting is taking some degree of responsibility for the accuracy of their post, the same way one would before passing on information in a conversation. On the other hand, though, it's just a share. We see this attitude coming through when Donald Trump, called out on one of his questionable tweets, retorts with, it's just a tweet. To fight fake news, then, Rini argues that we need to stabilize social media's norms of testimony so that, as she says, the same norms that keep us honest over cocktails will keep us honest in our posts. We need people to be held accountable for or to have a sense of responsibility for the information that they share with others. Her concrete proposal, give users a credibility score. So in practice, this would be an amendment to Facebook's system. Using independent fact-checking organizations, Facebook flags problematic news and warns users before they repost it. When a user tries to post something that has been identified as false or misleading, a pop-up appears that explains the problem and identifies the original source. It then asks the user to confirm that they would like to continue with their repost. A user's credibility score for Rini would depend on how often they choose to ignore these warnings and pass on misleading information. Quote, a green dot by the user's name could indicate that the user hasn't chosen to share much disputed news. A yellow dot could indicate that they do it sometimes, and a red dot could indicate that they do it often, unquote. The idea then is that a credibility score would incentivize users to take responsibility for what they share and would also give others a sense of their reliability as sources. So Rini comes up with this solution through a careful analysis of why we are so gullible to fake news. I will leave it up to you to consider this proposal in light of the various rights and opportunities required for a democratic public sphere. Does Rini's proposal violate or threaten freedom of expression? Does it promote or hinder our access to reliable information, our access to diversity of views, or does it promote or hinder our communicative power? It is these sorts of questions that we hope that you will start to ask yourself when thinking through the following sorts of issues. What problems do fake news, hate speech, polarization, etc. pose to democracy? How successful are various attempts by companies like Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook to address these problems? And how might particular design features of social media platforms promote or hinder these particular rights and opportunities? Whether as a future computer scientist, a tech industry leader, or just as a user of these technologies, we hope asking these sorts of questions will help you navigate these tricky issues with a more critical eye.
We're really looking forward to the sorts of design choices that you'll be making in the future.
Great, thanks so much for having us here today, and best of luck to everybody.